Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of our last few remaining lessons before we go into the summer break. We are going to begin studying about the Peloponnesian War and the major conflict that pretty much led to the end of the classical Greek world and entered Greece into a period called the Hellenistic period. The Peloponnesian War. Is it important? Why are we studying this? Well, we live in an imperfect world, and war is a very unfortunate reality of this world. And it is here no matter how much we would wish otherwise. I see different signs and different little spray paintings about world peace, but we must understand that there does not appear to be any solution to our conflicts or to our problems. And there are unfortunate realities that we have to deal with in life. And if we cannot solve problems amongst ourselves and our families, it is a very difficult thing to believe that we can handle the much larger issues of conflicts between nations and expect that they will turn out any differently. However, if we understand what causes war, we may be able to better avoid future conflict or lessen the degree to which we fight. Some wars have been avoided because we are able to bring people to the table and say, we have been here before, we have experienced these problems, and it's led to death on a great scale. The much more likely outcome is that we may be able to lessen the degree to which we fight, meaning that rather than having a strong and World War III or IV, we may experience a conflict that is much more local and manageable. And it is important to point out that since the creation of the United Nations, which was supposed to be set up for the purpose of creating world peace, there have been more documented conflicts in the 20th century than any other period in history. So because that mandate has not been thoroughly fulfilled or recognized, we need to understand what leads to war. And the Peloponnesian War is often seen as a perfect model of what leads to war and why people fight and have these massive disagreements. And it's applicable to World War I, II, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, and can actually be applied to the conflict between China and the United States right now. And while many of us do not directly experience war, we are all impacted by it as governments change, social systems change, and life becomes different. Not fighting or participating directly does not guarantee any safety from its effects. And so, because of that reality, we've got to look at these conflicts and understand how they start and where they may lead. Now, the chief cause of the Peloponnesian War was the fight between two minor allies of the major powers of Sparta and Athens. And because the two minor allies were fighting against each other and neither Athens nor Sparta could control them, they eventually did have to go to war. This was the chief concern during the Cold War, that two minor allies, one on the side of the Russians and one on the side of the Americans, would actually go to war, and this would draw the Americans and the Russians into World War III. We are very much at that point again with China and the United States. And we also see this in other areas where there are complex political and social alliances that often stand in very stark contrast, and we'll see more detail on that in the near future. And so, because of the nature of the conflict, it really does seem in some way to have been inevitable, to have been predetermined. Athens and Sparta split the Greek world almost precisely evenly, and they had a sharp distinction in their government system, their ideologies, and the purposes to which they were driving these. And eventually those would clash. And when you have such stark differences in such a small area, it almost certainly will lead to conflict. The Cold War could have broken out into World War III, and that it did not, and that it actually just kind of resulted in a time of peace was an amazing thing. However, we need to understand that in many ways, the Cold War was a World War III because the Soviet Union collapsed economically. They just couldn't continue the Cold War. Had Sparta or Athens not fought directly with ships and spears and swords, but had driven the conflict more economically and socially, we would have seen the same result. But they chose war, direct conflict. The United States chose economics. And so we have two different outcomes. Now, the principal historian of the Peloponnesian War was Thucydides, and he was the perfect person to write about it. He was an Athenian general, yet he lost the city of Amphipolis to a Spartan force being led by Brasidas. And he entered exile, which was mandated by the Athenian assembly. He did return near the end of the war to Athens, but he was found dead, most likely assassinated, before he could complete his history of the war. The next historian of the war was Xenophon, who covered the period after the Syracusan defeat until the defeat of Athens at Aegospotami, or Goat Rivers. An important leader that I have talked about before in the previous lessons was Pericles. And Pericles would guide the Athenians for 1 year, but died in the second year's plague and disaster. So he was off the scene, and new leaders would emerge in Athens as a result of his passing. And his strategy remained fairly intact through the time period of the war. However, that determination to stick to one single strategy would actually lead to Athens's defeat. Now, the war did resolve the central question or spark of the war. The war aims did change over time, but eventually it did result in what Sparta was ultimately after, the destruction of the Athenian Empire. That was basically what they needed to accomplish. And Athens' ability to claim maritime power. Now, the war began a tangled process wherein eventually Athens would be stripped of all authority. And in the final analysis, it led to the ascension of Philip of Macedon and Alexander in their power over Greece. So nobody could really see it at the time or predict where it would go. But the war did eventually change the very nature of Greece. And it brought down the power and capability of both sides to such a degree that eventually Sparta, which claimed victory in the Peloponnesian War, would be later on defeated by a coalition led by Athens, ironically enough. Yet when Athens tried to reemerge as an empire again and established a second maritime league, they were attacked by many of the city-states who had a very long memory about their first time at being an empire. And so this resulted in what was called the Social War. And at the end of the Social War, there were no major powers or authorities in Greece, and much of the shipbuilding process had robbed Greece of wood, lumber, timber, and the capability of producing more warships. And they had outsourced this to Philip of Macedon. Philip took advantage of this situation and the weakened state of all of the city-states to invade Greece. And as I say, the rest is history. We then move into the Philip, Alexander era, and then into the successor states. So the Peloponnesian War, it ends one period and then it begins a whole nother period in Greek history and Greek affairs. Unfortunately, we cannot get into that further outcome. But understand, war does change everything. It is not an isolated or neat little compact thing that leaves the world as it was. No, it always has a change, and we cannot always understand the changes immediately. And often the immediate changes are temporary, and there are more significant long-term changes that must be recognized and dealt with. That's all for this video. Please do your homework. Please remember to turn that in as soon as possible. Thank you.